The LLM model timeline. Let's get to it. So I'm recording this on my lunch break. This will be a one take, and so if I make some mistakes, please bear with me, but let's go ahead and start. Before we get to the timeline, I do want to start over here on the left here. I want us to be clear on what it means to have a high training cost. And so when these LLM models are being made, they have a certain pool of data that they're trained on. You can view these as tokens, right? It's a nice little pretty diagram. And these produce param models based on their pass and fail criteria. And so you can kind of view the parameters as weights and biases that determine a good opportune output from this criteria. And so for you, the end user, that translates to a higher inference cost. The higher the params, typically the higher the inference cost. Now obviously companies are at will to charge you whatever they want, but for the most part you can correlate higher bill param with higher input cost. And so now that's out the way, let's go ahead and start. We are going to start off in 2020. You can kind of view this as like a Star Wars Episode 3 start, because honestly, the earlier years were kind of uneventful, and it wasn't really until 2020 when you started to see actual major advancements in AI. Excuse me. And so let's start with GPT-3. This came out in 2020, and so it was a 175 bill param model. Its estimated training cost is about $4.6 million. With the in and out here, so this would be per million tokens, you'd be spending 50 cents per million tokens out, 150. And so GPT-3, this was the release before most people were aware of AI. In 2020, nobody was really talking about it. You had some super deep engineer spaces that were talking about large language models, but the average consumer was definitely not privy to AI in 2020. I did find a tweet from John Carmack. He is going to be kind of our control group, so to speak, for this video. He's a good example of somebody who has dedicated his entire career to programming and has every reason to be anti-AI, and yet he really isn't, right? And so the reason I use him as an example is because we do have some tweets that he's made over time throughout this time period. And so this tweet here, this came from 2020. And you can hear, he says, I used to say that AI research seemed to have an odd blind spot towards automation of programming work. And I suspected a subconscious self-preservation bias. The recent, almost accidental discovery that GPT-3 can sort of write code does generate a slight shiver. And so this comment here really gives the idea that GPT-3, while it did have some coding capabilities, it really wasn't enough to feel it was going to do anything major. And you see in the response to this Eric Lepert, he mentions, I worked for over a year on an AI program repair project that suggests new bug fixes learned from previous changes. If there's demand for automatically inserting, and he gives some code here, we could fulfill it. Anything more sophisticated than that is a ways off, I suspect. Now, Eric Lipper, he couldn't be any more wrong, right? It wouldn't be much longer, really, before this use case he described was just freaking peanuts to the LLM. But still, I think it's good to see this, right? This is 2020. Envision yourself in 2020. 2020, I think that was the year, I want to say that was the year the Xbox Series X and PS5 came out, something like that. It was also the year prior to COVID, I believe. So you can kind of view, yourself in this space. And if we go further here, we can see I concluded what it was like to interact with the early models. And so this was the playground, which is what you use to interact with GPT-3. Now I did list, if I go up here, I did list that this is going beyond local. This is to kind of contrast with the prior years. The prior years, the models that they were releasing were very small. So GPT-2 was 1.5 bill, GPT-1 was only 117 mil params. Very small models. And these models, really, you could run these on just about any computer. Like a 1.5 bill param model, that's going to run on a pretty mid-sized computer for the time, probably. Actually, well, 2019, maybe mid to high, but for the most part, this is a very realistic model you can run locally. Whereas with GPT-3, this is very much beyond local, right? Most computers, if not every computer watching this video, probably cannot run this model locally. And this is in 2020. This model, even today, would be extremely hard to run on your computer. And so that's where this beyond local aspect comes from. And the way that you interacted with it, because it wasn't local, was through an API. And so OpenAI, they offered this playground where you could prompt the LLM. And you can see here on the right side, there's some parameters that are really not consumer friendly that you would never see in like a modern era model, like frequency penalty, presence penalty. Very much this was an engineer, non-consumer type of interface. Anyway, let's continue, right? So 2020, we now have that in our head. Let's go to 2021. 2021, I'm coining as kind of the era that we went beyond text. And so this was the release of DALL-E, which is an OpenAI image generation model. This was a very small param model. I imagine you probably could run this on your local machine even. And here is kind of the headline of their releasing of it. Definitely, 2021, especially with how small this wasn't like an insane image generation thing. It definitely was impressive. Like here we see an illustration of a shrimp and a beanie sipping a latte. Honestly, this is really good. This is like enough to get a proof of concept up and running with images. And so definitely I wanted to include this here because I think it shows really how far we were ahead of image generation. Even in 2021, we had pretty impressive image generation coming out of these models here. And so that pretty much summarizes 2021. It's a very small list of things here. Now I'm leaving some things out that I felt weren't as impactful. For the most part, 2021 was not a major year for LLMs in my opinion. I would say this is kind of the calm before the storm, which I'll get into in the next year, 2022. This is the era I'm calling the calm before the storm. And the reason I say that is because truly this is the start of everything. Personally, I was in college in 2022. This is my last year of college. And I remember grumblings of LLMs being talked about at my school. Right? People were talking about these LLMs in 2022. This is a real thing. We realized, okay, this could be the future. And so this was the release of GPT 3.5. This is a 175 bill per M model. So it's quite a big difference over the GPT-3 in terms of its training cost, but the param size wasn't changed at all. And actually, it's cheaper than GPT-3. And so GPT 3.5, really all it did was fine-tune GPT-3. So it took, basically, I don't fully know the full data set that GPT 3.5 used. I imagine it used additional data on top of 3. But most of the advancements that were made with 3.5 were in the fine-tuning. And so while 3.5 implies it wasn't a major improvement over 3, it was a major improvement. Okay, going from 2020 GPT-3 to 2022 GPT 3.5, there was a big improvement in its effectiveness just because of the fine-tuning that they did and likely the increase of their data set. Now, when I was looking online, it seemed to me to imply that the training cost was less than GPT-3. If that's the case, we can assume a lot of the data they trained on was the same as the prior gen model, but they had made, again, a lot of fine-tuning. And so if we scroll down here, we can see, okay, some pretty obviously interesting things, okay? Before we get to this, because this is a big deal, I want to mention this part. This is John Carmack, right? We mentioned him earlier. We showed one of his tweets earlier in 2020, where it really felt like the vibe was, it's kind of there, it can kind of write code, but it's not really. Here you see a completely different sentiment. And so here is him commenting about ChatGPT, and its ability to parse and explain code is quite impressive. But he does mention you can't trust the reasoning. But if you read this, you really get the vibe of somebody who sees this as a real meaningful tool, whereas in the years prior, it was just kind of a neat party trick. And as I alluded to up here, this was the year of ChatGPT. This is what really spearheaded AI in the consumer space. When ChatGPT came out, everyone was talking about AI. Right? This is when your mom and your dad started to use it. This was a big deal. This ChatGPT release was a very big deal. And if we go a little bit deeper, we'll see that this is also the year of GitHub Copilot. Now I see the release here is October 2021. I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe it really didn't take off until 2022, which is why I have it under 2022. I think they had some beta testing in 2021. And so anyway, ignoring that portion of it, really this is when GitHub Copilot started to become a real thing. Excuse me. And so with that came, enterprise AI adoption. Definitely companies weren't using AI on a high level at this point. I think I heard here and there companies talking about it, but definitely it was not like a thing where every engineer was using AI tools. And so this, part of why I call it the calm before the storm, it was getting there, right? This is laying the foundations of what's going to come in the next few years. I also included here, and this is kind of an announcement for H100s, NVIDIA's H100s. This isn't really part of the the timeline, but definitely I think it's worth just kind of giving you perspective. Like this was the year H100 started to become a thing. And really, this is the year prior to NVIDIA's stock really going crazy, right? The next year is when NVIDIA's stock freaking skyrocketed, computer hardware became absolutely bonkers, and you couldn't afford a good computer without spending a shit ton of money. And so I just wanted to include this here for your perspective, right? This is just before the NVIDIA AI freaking stock increase. And so now let's move on to the next year, 2023. This is the year I'm calling the start of the AI revolution. 2023 is pretty much when we started to realize, oh shit, this isn't just a cool tool. Like this can actually change the way we work, if not replace our jobs. And it's also the year that training costs became insane. And so you're going to see here GPT-4, really, at least the estimates. Now the estimates could be wrong. I will say this, and I'll get to this a bit later, but for now, let's just look at the training costs and see, it was estimated about $100 million to train GPT-4, whereas GPT 3.5 was in the realm of, $4 or $5 million. Pretty big jump, right? Pretty big jump. I do have the price listed here for GPT as in per million as $5 and out per million as 15. However, this is a undersell of how bad this pricing was, because when GPT-4 came out, I don't know if you were around playing with the AI tools, but when GPT-4 came out, it was so overpriced. I can't remember the exact out amount because they changed it, but it was so bad that you were like, are you kidding me? Because compared to GPT 3.5, GPT-4 wasn't insane. It didn't have as big of a wow factor coming from 3 to 3.5 as 3.5 to 4. And it cost a shit ton more. And so people were really upset. I would say a big sentiment here when OpenAI released this model was, hey, what the hell, right? You're charging us a shit ton more, and really I wouldn't consider it a much better product. And so it was really a letdown for most people that were playing around with the AI tools in this time. And then this also, 2023, actually, before we get to that, because I realized I did miss something, and I think it might have been, oh, you know what, I might not have included, oh, here we go. Okay, so one thing I forgot to mention in 2020, which was important, was the departure of Dario Amodei, right? In 2020, he left OpenAI. And so again, kind of putting your head back in the 2020 era when we had this awful, really not there yet system, that is the year when Dario Amodei left OpenAI and would end up being a very big deal in the future, right? So this is 2020. This is a few years before it really started to come to fruition. He did work on GPT-2 and GPT-3, and then fast forwarding to where we were talking about today, 2023, that is the year when Claude V1 and V2 came out. Now, Claude V1 and V2, this is the point where you realized this is a competition. Prior to Claude, it was basically OpenAI and that's it, right? We had some rumblings about Google getting into the space, but nobody had on their radar this idea of Claude becoming this absolutely game-changing thing. Now, V1 and V2, they were really good, but I don't think they made that much of an impact, right? I don't think the impact it made is nearly as much as the coming years, which I'll show in a bit here. But really, it showed that there is competition. And so Claude V1 and V2, these were estimated about 50 bill per AM models. Now, there is one thing I want to be clear here. When I say 200 bill per AM up here, and I say 50 bill per AM down here, these are estimates, okay? And also, I want you to look at the training cost, and I want you to realize some of this training cost is assuming a master of experts. So what is a master of experts? Well, I didn't write that down, but I want to make sure we're clear. So let's say OpenAI releases a new model. Let's say OpenAI releases GPT-6. So when they release this GPT-6, here is really how it goes. They release a massive param. If you look at it as a whole, they're going to release it and people will say, oh, it's a 1,500 bill per AM model, right? I've seen this number thrown around for, I think, the newer Anthropic models where people are calling it, over 1 trillion params. But what they really mean here is that it's multiple smaller bill param models in one, otherwise known as a mixture of experts, or MOA. And so I should have separated this out. Again, this is one take, so you do kind of have to bear with me with some of these, but when they release this, right, this is actually, in reality, many smaller models. So you might have a 100 bill per AM model dedicated to coding. You might have a 100 bill per AM model dedicated to summarizing, maybe to writing, right? This is just a rough example. You'd have to look into kind of how the nitty-gritty works, but for the most part, when they release these models and they're claiming 1,500 bill, really what they mean is it's a culmination of a mixture of experts. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because earlier on when I mentioned how, let's say, one example, GPT 3.5 being 175 bill per AM, if we go earlier, you can see, okay, GPT-2 is 1.5 bill per AM. And then, there's a pretty big, massive increase in the param size if you go on Google and you search, say, GPT-4, and you see, oh, well, really, it's listed as freaking 800 bill per AM, whatever. In reality, if you focus on just one specific use case, it's probably in the realm of 200 bill per AM. And so, although you might see listings about it being 1,500, keep in mind it's a mixture of experts. And so, when we're looking at this here, we can't really know how these compare. Right? This is the point I'm making. Although GPT-4 is estimated at 200 bill per AM, we don't know if that's including each individual use case or if it's including all of it. With Claude, there's a pretty big assumption that most of this 50 bill is dedicated to coding, right? A good portion of it is. Whereas there's a good chance a lot of the GPT-4 model isn't purely dedicated to coding in that 200 bill per AM. And so while Claude is a much smaller bill per AM model, it can be much more effective at coding than GPT-4, partially because of the per AM count being different per model, but then also, as we alluded to earlier, the amount of data that goes in, right? Just because a 10 bill or 2 bill per AM model comes out does not mean it's trained on the same amount of data. Earlier models, they were trained on, hundreds of gigabytes of internet data. Now they're trained on probably terabytes, if not whatever's beyond terabyte. And so they're still producing these same, 30 bill per am, 100 bill per am individual models, but they're packing them together as one mixture of experts. I might have confused you even more. I hope I didn't, but to me, that's something I wanted to get across, just so we're clear on that when we're comparing these models. 2023 was also the release of Gemini 1.0. Now, Gemini honestly didn't matter in this time. It was kind of cool to see Google get into the AI race. I think they started with, I think it was called Bard before Gemini. The one thing that Google was doing that was impressive to me was the price. And so even looking at this here, you can see they were charging quite a bit less for their in and out cost. They also had a pretty big focus on speed. And so later on, I'll show that, they had some flash models that they released. And, really their focus was different from GPT and Claude. I feel like in this time period, GPT and Claude were, I feel like Claude was trying to be specific for the coder. And so they're honing in on their coding capabilities. GPT-4 was kind of trying to be the general use model. And then Gemini was just kind of getting their feet wet. And I really feel like they were focusing on speed over everything else at this time. Now, let's go into 2024. I'm calling this the year of Anthropic. The reason I call it that is because, in my opinion, this is the year Anthropic really cemented themselves as a real competitor, if not better, than OpenAI. And so this is the year that Claude 3.5 was released. It's estimated to be about 200 bill per ams. Again, as I talked about earlier, and I won't go back into, we can't really give an accurate estimate of how much that's dedicated to one specific use case. But anyway, Claude 3 and Claude 3.5, they came out. And one thing they did was they increased the price a little bit. So the in and out was a bit higher for Sonnet. Sonnet is kind of like the general use case, and that's why I'm using that example here. They had other versions of the model that I think were more expensive, but for the average user, you were using Sonnet. You're not going to use some overly expensive model for some niche use case. Now, it is worth mentioning too, although the price went up, right? We went from I just realized it says in twice. We did go from 290 in to 860 out, up to 3 in, 15 out. However, you can't look at that and see the whole picture, because there's definitely some efficiency improvements that happen with these models. And so while the price went up, it's very likely, and actually it's fact, they've improved the efficiency of these models. And so before 3.5, like let's say we're using Claude 1 or 2, it may have taken you it might have taken you 10 prompts to achieve something. Whereas in Claude 3.4, because of how much better the models were, it may have only taken you 2 to 3 prompts. Right, so that's one example of the efficiency improvement. And there's other aspects to it too. Like even outside of the effectiveness, there's things that they've done in these newer models that reduce the cost in the end. And so just keep that in mind. Excuse me. And then outside of Claude, we did get GPT-4o. Now, this is part of why I believe this year ended up going to Anthropic, is because really 4o was a freaking dud. I mean, the year prior, they gave us GPT-4 and it was way overpriced. GPT-4o, I felt like it really didn't do anything amazing when it came to the coding space. It had some improvements in the general use case for sure, but when it came to coding, there was never a time where I really cared about 4o, at least personally. And definitely, I think they took the previous case of overpricing their GPT-4 and having to correct it. I think they took that into this model and into account because they did lower the price. But overall, when these two models were out, when Claude and GPT-4o were going head to head, Claude was above and beyond. I mean, it was significantly better at coding than GPT-4o. There was no question about it. And that was part of what led this to be, in my opinion, the year of Anthropic. Because GPT, OpenAI, they were not focused on a specific use case. They were so harping on being the catch-all that they ended up losing ground when it came to the one thing that Claude was aiming at, which was coding. This is also the year that Gemini 1.5 came out, which is estimated at about 50 bill per am, so kind of in line with 4o. Again, mixture of experts. Let's assume that this is for a specific use case. Now, Gemini 1.5, I couldn't find a Flash version online. I don't know if they had one, to be honest, with 1.5. But still, you can see even with this, their pricing was a lot cheaper, right? Google was definitely trying to be a loss leader when it came to the AI race. Even today, their models are pretty cheap. And so their goal is to kind of, get users hooked on it, charge them really low amounts because, Google can afford to lose a lot of money on these models. And that was part of their angle there. Now, you'll notice I do list the estimated training price as who knows. And the reason for that is because it's honestly really hard to get a good guesstimate online. It just is. The only one I could find was for 4o, where Sam Altman did come out and say that the training cost was 100 mil, or about 100 mil. However, we can't fully trust him on that, right? We can't assume that that's 100% accurate. For all we know, he has benefit of reducing that amount. Because, if you're an AI company, you want to make yourself look as profitable as possible. And so obviously it benefits them to lower this amount, right? They don't want to say that it costs them $100 million to train something. And so at least me personally, I think it ended up costing more than that. If we look at the estimates that I've seen for these older ones, And these estimates, by the way, these came from online research as well. We can't be 100% sure for these ones either, but I think these seem more realistic to me. And so if we go from here to here, I would venture to guess this costs more than 100 mil, probably closer to 300 mil. I mean, that's just a number that I'm throwing out based on what I've seen in prior gens, but don't take this as a guarantee. But I do kind of give up trying to estimate the later ones because really you can't know. There's just so many variables that are involved, and with the hardware costs, it's hard to estimate how much training cost goes into these, and they're often very secretive about it, right? Because they don't want to tell you they're losing freaking hand over fist on training cost. But anyway, so that's the start of 2024. I already kind of showed some John Carmack tweets in prior years. This one I think is worth looking at because it really shows the shift that we made in perception to these models. And so he says, LLM assistants are going to be a good forcing function to make sure all app features are accessible from a textual interface as well as a GUI. Yes, a strong enough AI can drive a GUI, but it makes so much more sense to just make the GUI a wrapper around a command line interface that an LLM can talk to directly. So why is this tweet interesting? To me, it's interesting because he's really not talking about the LLM's capabilities anymore, right? At least not at a granular level. If we go to one of his earlier tweets, he's really talking specifically, like, can sort of write code, does generate a slide. Like, he's very specifically harping on the ability to just write code. Whereas in this one, it feels more forward-looking. Like, where is LLM going to end up? Before, it felt like we were seeing what could LLM do. Now we're thinking, where can it go? And so you see that in this message here. I feel like it's a lot more forward-looking than the prior tweets that I found of his. And you can see here a response from Karpathy. The question is, will top AIs get better at GUI faster than all apps add text? I think I have a guess. So really all of the sentiment around AI in 2024, it really felt like we realized that this is no longer a future, this is a present, right? This is what's going to change our lives. Our jobs are going to be impacted by this, no question about it. That's the vibe I got from 2024. And so that's 2024. It looks really small, right? Compared to the other timeline entries that I have, this is very small. However, we cannot understate the value of Claude being released at this time. This was a huge shift in the way we use the models. Right? Prior to Claude 3, 3.5, in my opinion, the AI sucked ass. I mean, it was not producing code that you would want to ship with. A lot of the times it would make so many mistakes. 3 and 3.5 was the point where you could have it do basic operations without even thinking about it. Like, you could have it design a landing page and it would do so and you wouldn't have to worry about it. This started with 2024. Now, moving on to 2025. This one I am listing as the year China shocks the AI world, and also when widespread enterprise adoption really started. So 2025, as we all hopefully can remember, is the year DeepSeek R1 came out. This was a big deal because it really made us see that we have limitations as far as price goes. OpenAI and Claude, they were charging a pretty penny. Gemini was kind of trying to tackle that themselves. But Gemini's models were so far behind, dude. It was like, yeah, you're paying way less, but you're getting way less. And so before DeepSeek R1 came out, you were getting what you paid for. If you wanted a model that was capable, you had to pay the premium. DeepSeek R1 came out, and dude, it was like you were paying peanuts and getting good output. Now, obviously, DeepSeek R1, it was a distilled model. When I say China shocks the AI world here, I'm not saying China was smarter than the US or did something revolutionary. Reality is they lived off of the back of OpenAI's prior models or whoever they distilled off of. But it was important because what it did is it created this incentive to reduce the price. Right? We can no longer get away with just charging whatever we want. We need to kind of clamp it down a bit. And you see that because in this year, the year prior, Haiku, this was a model that came out that was kind of a cost-effective solution. 3.5 Haiku was okay. Even today, I feel like Haiku is kind of hit or miss, but definitely, even Anthropic has tried to maintain a lower cost option for certain tasks. But dude, once DeepSeek R1 came out, I really started to see a shift in particularly OpenAI's tone, right? Anthropic honestly didn't change too much when R1 came out, and that was because R1 just wasn't as good. Right, if you compare R1 to GPT-4, it was comparable. Like DeepSeek R1 was really able to produce as good output as GPT-4, if not better, and cheaper. But if you compared R1 to say 4.5 Sonnet or Opus, especially Opus, absolutely not, right? So Claude definitely still held the flag in terms of its capabilities. And so while DeepSeek R1 didn't impact Anthropic, it definitely impacted OpenAI, right? We saw that they came out with Codex, which was their coding-specific model. And to me, this is when I started to use OpenAI models as my daily driver. In my opinion, Codex models were the best. They have GPT 5.4 now, which I'll get into later. In my opinion, it's not as good as the Codex models, but that's neither here nor there. Codex was really the start when OpenAI started to take coding seriously, at least in my opinion. And so you see here, the price is definitely higher than R1, absolutely, but they make up for it by actually being a good model. 5.2 Codex is, the way I viewed it at this time period, so 2025 era, I viewed OpenAI models as the engineer-headed models, right? So these are the models that engineers are using. They're giving their exact specifications and requirements. They want code that's readable, and they want to actually have some connection to the code base. They use GPT-5. People who are less tied to the code base, maybe they just want a proof of concept, or maybe they don't understand the domain very well, and so they just want to have it kind of fill in the blanks for them. You use the Anthropic models. That was how I felt in the 2025 era. And so you had two models that really serve different purposes. GPT-5 pretty much listens to exactly what you say and will give you an output based on it. Whereas Anthropic's models, they'll listen to what you say, but for the most part, they're going to fill in the blanks for you, right? They're going to make decisions that you aren't even thinking about to get to an output that often is better than what you thought about, but not always, right? Sometimes you do want a very specific input, output, and for the most part, GPT-5 was the factor there. And so this was the year where OpenAI got their shit together, right? Partially due to the DeepSeek R1 release, right? If DeepSeek R1 didn't come out, in my opinion, I don't think they would have released this as quickly, and definitely I think they wouldn't have priced it like this. I mean, they could have easily charged an equal amount towards Anthropic's with Codex. Like, yeah, definitely Anthropic's models do a little bit more heavy lifting in terms of its thought, but absolutely, these are both very capable models. And in some cases, GPT-5 Codex models were better than even 4.5 Sonnet. But because of R1, OpenAI realized, dude, we gotta cut our prices down here, man. We can't risk China taking all of our income. And so the prices are a lot more, I would say a lot better. Like I said earlier, GPT-4, this is really not even telling the whole story. It was way more expensive than this. And then going into Codex, this was really good. I mean, even today, right? Codex models, you can code a shit ton and spend very little, right? This is the era where they started to really care. Then we also had Gemini 3. So Gemini 3, it's not the best at coding. I'll give you that. The reason I mention it here, though, is because Gemini 3 does something that the other models don't do, which is one, it's very cheap, which is partially due to Google, having so much money. Number two, it really is fast. It's fast as hell, dude. Like, you can have it summarize an entire code base very, very quickly. I've always felt like it's really good at explaining code. And, basically, me, from my perspective in 2025, I was using GPT-5 when I wanted serious engineer work. I was using Anthropic models when I didn't know what the fuck I was doing and wanted to get a good output. And I used Gemini 3 when I just wanted to learn and understand concepts. That was my tech stack, right? I was using these interchangeably for different tasks. And so Gemini 3 Flash to me is an important model. And it's still, to this day, I do think their Flash models are pretty impressive. I'll get to it later, but definitely Flash is no longer the nice cheap model that we used to know and love, unfortunately. But in this era, it was. Like, I would consider in this era, each one had their own use case, and it was a good balance. 2025 was also the launch of Claude Code and Codex. And so this was really the start of the consumer-friendly interfaces, right? This is when your mom and dad can come in and code actual working products, right? Most people don't want to have to go through the painstaking process of downloading an IDE, understanding how extensions work, all this bullshit, right? They just want to download a program and get to prompting. And that's what these two achieve. And we also see it was the launch of Nano Banana, right? Everyone remembers Nano Banana's launch in 2025, where really it made you realize the dangers of AI. I would say prior to Nano Banana, prior to Nano Banana, I wasn't scared, right? I didn't see much that AI could do that could actually interfere with people's quality of life. Nano Banana changed that, right? I started to think about how really you could get pretty realistic spoofs that would convince old people and non-tech savvy people very easily with Nano Banana. And it's gotten even better, right? It's got even more crazy. So Nano Banana was a very big release. Honestly, it put a lot of lenses on the risks of AI, I would say. Seeing, actual visual changes and believable output from Nano Banana really made you scared. Like, dude, where's this going to go? I also have listed here, Meta is going to let job candidates use AI during coding tests. The reason I included this is because this is where you realize, dude, AI is now. It is not the future. It is now, right? We have job applications that are requiring it as a test. To me, that is a good sign of that. Now, I think Leak Code is going to be around forever. I don't think it's ever going to go anywhere. And I don't know if every company is going to adopt this new AI tool test, but they may, right? This might be a thing because it really should be. I would say the average day-to-day task that you're doing, you're not going to do anything but prompt. So it makes sense to test this for sure. And Meta has always been ahead of that kind of a thing. And so this was an interesting point to include. Right, Mark Zuckerberg has said vibe coding will be a major part of Meta's engineering work in the near future. I would say that's already, it's already there. Right, if this was commented in early 2025, it's already there. We're already at the point where Majority of code is being written through a prompt. Another thing I included here was the impacts of layoffs around this time period. Now, I see a lot of sentiment about how AI has impacted layoffs, but when you look at this data, right, let's think about it. 2023, remember 2023. Remember how we talked about 2023, how, it really wasn't a major thing, right? GPT-4 was good, but it wasn't enough to replace your job, right? Claude V1, V2, it wasn't there yet. And so it didn't feel like coding was really taking a major thing here. But dude, when you look at these layoffs, you see 2023 was the biggest year for these layoffs. And when you look at these numbers, which, the year that I feel like it really started to be scary was 2024, the layoff numbers are way less. And if you look at 2025, which is definitely beyond where I thought, you would expect more, it barely increased. And so to me, this tells me that a lot of these layoffs were not AI related. Like a majority of them are not AI related. I encourage you to look into this. There's a lot of data points that support that idea, but definitely I think you can look at this and you can look at a lot of data that you can find online that shows that these layoffs were not just because of the AI. There was other reasons impacting it, and this proves it, right? We had shitty ass AI in those prior years, and we were still seeing not a big increase in layoffs when we did get good AI. So that should tell you that. 2025 was also the beginning of the AI doomer circle jerk, as I call it. This is when YouTubers started to profit off of being the anti-AI position. Right, a lot of people were upset when AI started getting good because they were getting laid off. And what do you do when you get laid off? You want to point your finger at something. And so they pointed at the AI. They say, oh, this is the reason. And so you have these doomer content circle jerkers. They profit off of this, and they'll make a big deal about how AI can't do this, it can't do that, your job is safe because of this, yada yada yada. Basic doomer stuff. This really started taking off in 2025. Right, and it's still going very prominent today. I feel like it's lessening a little bit. I think people realize, okay, we can't act like AI can't do this stuff anymore, but still, you see a lot of doomers. And I also included this last bit here. This happened at the early onset of the next year, but it was so late in the year or early in the next year, I wanted to include it. And to me, it was a good capstone of this 2025 era. When Linus Torvalds himself used AI to, it was an anti-gravity he used to push a commit, or actually it was a full-on piece of software. I think it was like a visualization tool. Yeah, visualization tool. To me, this marked the era of, okay, dude, if Linus Torvalds is doing this and he's not even coding anymore, this should tell you we are done. This is the present. There's no such thing as an AI future. It's now. This is what we're using. To me, this really sealed the deal, right? There's no more, people from way back in the day, 20, 30 years ago that were coding, and even they're switching over to the AI tools. That's a sign that we're done. It's now AI coding, and that's all. Now, current year, right? This is the current year. Now, before I get to this current year, there is one thing I want to mention. Throughout this timeline, I've been very much ignoring some aspects of the local side of things, right? Throughout each of these years, 2022 onward, there are definitely a lot of local LLMs, open source projects. I didn't include those because in my opinion, they weren't impactful enough. And even today, I haven't felt the impact of a local LLM release. And so I don't feel it needs to be included. But there is one thing I do want to mention, and that was back in 2023, I believe it was, correct? Let's see here. When was this? I have to refresh my brain of when this happened. I think it was 2023, sorry. 2023 was the introduction of Llama CCP, or CPP. So this is really the year local LLMs took off, 2023. Llama CPP, it really kind of streamlined the process. It made it a lot easier to get up and running with the local LLMs. And then we also had the introduction of GGUF file format, which really reduced the overall file size of the LLMs. And these two in conjecture really made it a more streamlined process of using local models. And so if you look around for local models, you'll find different quantization levels. You can kind of view quantization as, if you're familiar with 3D modeling, where you take like a polygon or like a 3D object, and then you go through a simplification. Let me move this over here for you. Simplification, and then out comes another 3D object that's simplified, right? This is kind of how you can view quantization. So it takes in case of quantization, it takes in the LM, it does some simplification. I don't have enough details about the lower level of what quantization is doing, but the way you can view it as is similar to simplification of a 3D model. So you're taking in the model and you're getting a pretty close general shape of the original, but you're reducing it in such a way that it increases the performance and the speed. And so you'll see, if you look around for local models, you'll see different quantization levels. One of the common ones is 4-bit. And so with each quantization level, you gain a little bit of performance and speed, but you lose a little bit of the quality. For the most part, it looks like 4-bit is kind of the status quo as far as like a good balance between them. But really, this is where you start to see, okay, local LMs are picking up, right, in 2023. In my opinion, they're still not there. right? Even with all this you can quantize the frick out of a model, and you could do everything you want. It is still not capable to run on a local machine unless it's a very small, dumb model. You just cannot run, even if you go back to, like I mentioned, 2020, right? If you go back to GPT-3, this model is not going to run on your computer today. Even with quantization, even with all that, it's not going to run on your computer today. It's just not. And if it does, it's so dumbed down that it's no longer useful, and there's no point to it. And so this is something I just wanted to talk about here because I think it's worth mentioning. I'm leaving out a lot of the local LLM advancements, but you can kind of view 2023 as the start of local LLMs being a thing. But in my opinion, we are still not at a point where it is at all worth mentioning. I don't think it makes any impact that you see up here. You, as an average user, are going to have to interact with APIs, and you're going to have to use one of these models provided by one of the model providers because it's the only way you're going to get a good quality output. Anyway, going into the current year, 2026. Now, I'm calling this the era of level setting. The reason I'm calling it that is because I feel like today, this year, we're about halfway through the year, a little over halfway through the year. I feel as though we really are starting to see the prices come to a more realistic place. And what I mean by that is, at least me personally, 2024, 2025, I did not care too much about token cost. I mean, part of it was because GitHub Copilot was like a really stupidly good deal. But even outside of that, it felt like you could just prompt all day and you weren't worried too much about the cost. Nowadays, I feel like that's shifting a bit. Part of it's, due to the increase of the price. And so my mouse is messed up here. Opus was released back in 2025, but at least me personally, I didn't start using Opus until 2026 with 4.6 up to 4.8. And I would say in current year, all of my main coding tasks go through these upper tier models. Not the max end, right? Fable 5, I know it's not out anymore, but I wouldn't use this anyway because to me it's just way too expensive. But 4.8 Opus and 5.4 now, it's not Codex anymore. These are the models that I use on a daily basis today. And you can see from the cost, the ins and the out, it is a bit more expensive than what I was using back in the day, right? GPT-5 Codex was dirt cheap. And even today, I would say 5.4 is a good value, but definitely we're seeing a change in the pricing. It's no longer just prompt at your will and don't even look at the bill. Now you have to think about the bill a little bit, man. There's a definite increase in the price that I'm feeling personally. I've mentioned about how the efficiency has improved, but even though we've improved efficiency, these models are getting so freaking massive. They train on so much data these days that it's expensive. It costs them so much to train these, and so they kind of have to make it back in the inference, and we're seeing that with the price increases. And unfortunately, DeepSeek R1, in this year it made sense and it was able to release, but I don't envision a world where DeepSeek can do the same. I don't think it can make the same impact that it did back in 2025 because OpenAI's models are effective now, right? 2025, when DeepSeek R1 came out, OpenAI was caught slacking. They're not doing that no more, right? They're not slacking anymore. They have effective coding models. And so let's say in theory a DeepSeek came out, odds are first of all, it's not going to be this cheap, right? They're going to have to up the price. Everyone has to make enough money to stay afloat at the very least. But even outside of that, it's not going to make the same impact that it did back in 2025. And so unfortunately, we'll never likely see this happen again. And more than likely, at least the way it's currently trending, prices are going to continue to get kind of hitty. They're going to start hitting a bit. I do see some talks about local LLMs being used here and there, and companies kind of shifting away from crazy API usage and cost. If we go down further, we can see here Microsoft reports are exposing AI's real cost problem. Using the tech is more expensive than paying the human employees. I think this depends on the business use case. I think there are cases where that's true, and there's cases where it's not. So I'm not going to take this as a general true statement, but definitely you're seeing companies realize, dude, it is not cheap. We're spending money on these tokens, and we need to be smart about it. And you also saw, earlier in June, GitHub Copilot changing away from the usage-based billing. To me, this freaking sucks because when I started using Copilot, it was insane. Like you could get so much value out of your subscription. It was ridiculous. Now it's like, dude, you spend money now. It costs so much for Copilot now that I dropped my subscription to it and I just completely went all in on Codex subscription. And I'm pretty happy with Codex. I think you can get it quite a bit for the price. But definitely, dude, 2025, we had it made. I feel like in 2025, it was just smooth sailing. You weren't thinking about cost. It was just the greatest time ever. 2026, now we're starting to realize, okay, we do got to think about this a little bit. And so that's why I call it the era of level setting. Now, there are some notable mentions that I didn't mention here. We do have some releases, kind of more recent, GLM 5.2. There's too many goddamn models, dude. I couldn't list all of them out here. In my opinion, GLM 5.2, it doesn't do anything that impressive. I think the main impressive part is that it's cheap, but it's not cheap enough to where it would make me just drop GPT models, personally. So I didn't include that here. There was also another thing I had missed earlier, and And I kind of want to mention this now because it was important in our earlier discussions of kind of the idea of models, or sorry, what is it called? Mixture of experts. Right? I'm going to bring this up here so we can know what I'm talking about. Kind of how, we have this idea of mixture of experts, and also in discussion of the local models. So if you go and you try to do the local thing, or if you go and you download Qwen 3 Coder, Qwen 3 Coder is the kind of most popular coding model that I've seen. I think it's about a 30 bill per annum model. Most popular local LM for coding. This is what I've seen anyway from my research. And I tried to get into local LMs a lot, like over the span since 2022 even. Every year I'm like, okay, maybe I should look into local LMs. Pretty much every single time I end up in Qwen in some degree, and I'm not impressed by it, so I just drop it. But the question I list here, why does my local 30 bill LM suck compared to Claude's estimated 50 bill, right? When we go down here and we're listing, each individual models in the realm of 40 to 50 bill per am, certainly if I look at this 30 bill per am model, I would think, oh man, this should be performing pretty close, right? No. Kind of what I said earlier about mixture of experts, right? Qwen 3 Coder, when you see that it's a 30 bill per am model, yes, it is 30 bill per ams, but that is 30 bill comprised of multiple individual models, right? So you might have 10 individual 3 bill per am models with one dedicated, I just said dedicated WAM to coding, whereas the rest is, a bunch of other shit. Whereas Claude, it is a raw, straight up 50 bill dedicated, it's purely to coding. So there's a massive difference in what's being said as 30 bill. And the reason I bring it up again is because I see this a lot about how, these newer models, they're this bill per am, whatever. There's a deeper level that you have to look into to realize why it's different. And so I just wanted to double click on that real quick there. But I think that ends it, right? I think that's pretty much the gist of the timeline. Now, again, this isn't fully comprehensive. This is kind of just if you want like a high level overview of how the models have evolved, particularly with OpenAI and Anthropic, because they were the most impactful over these years. This is kind of a good general view of that. I hope you learned a few things. I mean, definitely I learned a lot going through and filling out these forms. I really didn't have a full picture of how each of these came out and aligned to each other, so it was nice to really see it. Like one thing that surprised me, like, launch of Cursor in 2023. To me, in my head, I thought this came out a year or two ago, but it's probably because I just wasn't paying attention to it. But it's like you really start to realize a lot of these things, they came out a long time ago, and some of these things, they just came out, and it feels like it's been out forever. Like it's nice to kind of take a step back and really see how this has progressed over the years. And so I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching, and yeah, this is all one take, and I'm way past my lunch break, so I gotta get going. Thanks.